are moving to the final address of our third and last plenary session. For that, I would like to invite our session chair, Professor Sthaneshwar Timalsina, Professor of Sanskrit at Stony Brook University, USA, an eminent scholar of classical Indic humanities and a distinguished authority in Indian philosophy and tantric studies. Currently serving as the Nirmal and Augustina Matto Chair at Stony Brook University, he has also enriched prestigious institutions such as San Diego State University, the University of California, Santa Barbara, and Washington University in St. Louis. A prolific academician, Dr. Timalsina has authored several acclaimed books and more than 80 research articles and book chapters. His remarkable contributions to Advaita philosophy, consciousness studies, and tantric visual culture have earned him international recognition. Through the Vimer's Foundation, he has also been generously offering free online courses on Tantra and Indian philosophy since 2019, inspiring learners across the globe. We are truly privileged to have Professor Sthaneshwar Timalsina sir with us today as the chair of this plenary session. Today he is going to address us on the topic In Search for the Philosophy of Mithila. I humbly call upon Professor Timalsina sir to deliver the address.
Thank you. Much has been said. This paper I wrote very shortly, and it's just a sort of a project that needs to be done by all of us, not one person, because what I believe is I'm trying to read the Upanishadic discourses to go back to before these bhashya commentarial systems came about, and how these philosophies were actually lived in the lands of Mithila. So I'm interested today in taking a voyage to the past, the era of the Upanishads, and tracing some essential teachings in today's context. For some texts survive for eternity, and I believe some of the categories discussed in proto-historical and partly mythical scenes from Mithila can guide us today. In this conversation, I shall only engage with the ideas developed in the Upanishadic era in the lands called Videha, the land that has the Kosala kingdom in its west and Magadha in its south. The most important book ever composed in the region of Videha, also known as Mithila or Tirabhukta, is the Satapatha Brahmana. The Brihadaranyaka Upanishad is the final section of this voluminous work. This text may have been compiled by different philosophers, but the major credit goes to Yajnavalkya. The book, the Brihadaranyaka, includes different philosophers, the major ones being Gargi Vachaknavi, Maitreyi, and Uddalaka Aruni. Even though the Ashtavakra Gita was composed much later, the character Ashtavakra comes from this very Upanishadic paradigm, and I'm also continuing counting him as a philosopher from Mithila, primarily for his conversation with Janaka. I do believe that the texts mentioned above need to be read again because there are several problems in the classical readings of these texts. So the problems, what are the problems? Number one, the commentaries prior to Shankara have become extinct. The commentary of Bharti Prapancha is cited by Shankara and Sureshwara in their works, but the commentarial work of Bharti Prapancha has been lost for a long time. If we were to gather the central philosophy of Bharti Prapancha, it appears to be very different in content from Shankara's reading. Our new reading is therefore not entirely a new endeavor, but rather an excavation of a long-lost tradition of the past itself, the text itself. Number two, The central philosophy of the Brihadaranyaka is separated from the Satapatha Brahmana in the traditional commentarial traditions. All the prominent acharyas from different sampradayas have read the Upanishads as a completely independent text, and nobody has made an effort to read the Upanishad like Brihadaranyaka as a section inside the Satapatha Brahmana, which is the case. There is a deeper cultural shift and a strategy in the trend of isolating the Brahmana text. Since the time of the Buddha, the Indian cultural landscape changed and the central ethos remained under the subjugation. Number three, the concept of moksha as freedom. What happened after the Sramana era, after the time of the Buddha? The original idea of freedom is derailed in this new Sramana trend, and it was reduced to the concept of liberation from samsara, with samsara being synonymous with bondage. This was a consequence of the growing influence of the Sramana traditions that viewed being in the world as a part of suffering and separation from the world, the body, the household life, and the ritual order as the singular means of salvation. If the early concept was about recognizing the world order and gaining freedom not from it but through it, the latter development made the world synonymous with suffering, and freedom became the freedom from samsara and not in samsara. The final point, the example of Janaka as liberated while living, Jivan Mukta Videha Janaka, became meaningless in this new paradigm. And in this new philosophy, a Jivan Mukta would be a person who has no societal responsibility, no ritual obligation, and no household routine life. The idea of Jivan, meaning while living, was not about simply living and breathing or existing before dying. On the contrary, this was the philosophy of living to the fullest extent, enjoying being in the world, being a king if so desired, and remaining liberated. The Tripura Rahasya reverses the role of Janaka as a disciple, with Ashtavakra being the teacher here. Whoever is the teacher, the central theme remains about choosing a lifestyle, not about attaining liberation alone. In the Mahabharata, the character Ashtavakra marries Suprabha, the daughter of sage Vadanya. If we were to reframe Videha philosophy, the original Upanishadic philosophy, as we can trace from the dialogues gathered in the Brihadaranyaka, without reductively reading it in isolation, but rather combining it with the philosophical insights that we can glean from the rest of the Satapatha Brahmana, we would be able to reverse the renunciatory paradigm and make Indian philosophy more applicable in the global context. Against this background, I would like to make some observations regarding the philosophy of the text under consideration. Number one, everyday life and ritual life intersect. The meaning discovered in rituals allows subjects to discover the meaning of their being in the world. Number two, tapas. Tapas is at the heart of living. Tapas mediates ritual life and everyday life. Number three, the body becomes a primary means of realization. The body is the mirror image of the cosmos, and the connection of Vishwa and Vaishwanara, or the individuated being and the embodied totality, becomes the subject of realization by means of tapas. Finally, basic yogic constituents such as the fivefold prana, the central channels in the heart, visualization of the sun, internalization of rituals, in particular the fire ritual, the stress on tapas, and the application of dharana in different forms of dhyana as prescribed in the Satapatha make Videha philosophy an early form of yoga. And I'm talking about Satapatha, roughly 8th century BCE, and Patanjali, the founder of yoga system, is broadly identified as a 4th century philosopher. So we are going like some 1200 years back, before the time of Patanjali, to trace the early history of yoga from Mithila, just to give you the historical context. Even though Shankara stressed a clear separation of realization from rituals, the very first chapter of the Brihadaranyaka starts with mapping self-realization onto the sacrificial horse in the Ashwamedha ritual. For someone not familiar with the ritual, the source remains meaningless, and when there is no mapping between the source and the target, the metaphor goes astray. There are two types of mapping: a metaphoric mapping of reality where nothing is what it seems, and every day and everything stands for something else, and the other mapping is the metrification of reality. Vedic thinkers are meticulous in metrifying everything. The sacrificial pit is mapped in proportion to the length of the sacrifice, the length of the sacrificer. The body is mapped in relation to samvatsara, or the calendrical days. So, so the bones in the body become mapped with the days in a year. The sacrificial post, or the yupa, is mapped in relation to the body, and again the body is mapped with different deities, such as the sun standing for the eyes and the ears corresponding with the wind and the breath. The meticulous effort invested in mapping results in the realization that one's bodily presence is identical to the cosmic being. One recognizes that everyday life is a simulation of the cosmic being, or the Hiranyagarbha. In this mapping, the ritual order is one in which a heterosexual couple is the participant. Reality itself is binary in this depiction, and the Purusha, or the singular being, divides itself into Pati and Patni, a man and a woman, in order to carry the ritual order. The terms Pati and Patni themselves are derived from the verbal root Pat, which means to split or to break, the single thing cracked into two halves. Living a householder life in this paradigm is not counterintuitive to recognizing reality, but actually constitutes living reality itself. Just as ritual observation and tapas are at the heart of living, dedicating life to each other, having progeny, and working toward prosperity are also essential to living the spiritual life. Spiritual life in this paradigm is not in contrast to a successful and good life. Rather, there is just one way of living a good life: seek prosperity, align oneself with the cosmic play of Purusha, or the embodied totality, recognize oneself as mirroring the totality, and make one's life simulate the very acts of Purusha, the embodied totality. Although it's not possible to address the entire philosophy of the Brihadaranyaka in a few pages, I would like to focus on some essential features of the Deha philosophy as recorded by Yajnavalkya. If Shankara's commentary relies on the Kanva recension, Sureshwara's Vartika prefers the Madandina recension, these technical differences do not affect the overarching observations I am making. The first observation relates to prana. By analyzing two tendencies towards being in the world, the daiva or transcendence, and the asura, the immanence, the text prefers the daiva as the preferred course of life. The daiva tendency seeks to recognize the temporality of being in the world, whereas the asura tendency seeks permanence in the body. Again, the etymology of asura is asun pranan rakshati, one who seeks merely to preserve life, gives a clear path of living, indicating that there are two ways of living life. One is the life of an ordinary man, an asura, who seeks to live merely for the sake of living. For him, there is no higher teleology for life. Life itself is the end, the goal, and not a means towards something higher. Daiva, on the other hand, seeks to use life as a means to recognize the totality. This recognition of the totality and mirroring the totality within, simulating one's everyday life, including ritual life, through the very acts of the totality by means of mapping life onto the cosmic cycles, the stages of life, or the embodied presence of different deities, which create a different teleology for life. In this paradigm, divine life is when ordinary living becomes a means for higher living, living for something beyond the body, beyond one's individuated being. Again, this totality is not merely an esoteric experience, for it seeks to recognize the totality in lived social life. Society itself is the lived animation of Purusha, and one's objective is to live in harmony with society. Second, the Purusha Vida section is central to depicting the binary nature of reality. But this binary is not that of Sankhya philosophy, where Purusha needs an escape from Prakriti. Rather, it is an interdependent binary that makes life possible. The cosmic reality itself is expressed here in binary terms, and the simulation of the totality as mirrored in the body is also found in the binary metaphor of man and woman. But the objective of this section seems deeper than a mere description of interdependence. It seeks to harmonize two tendencies in life, the life of realization and the life of action. Action without realization is blind, and realization without action is meaningless. The realization here is not an end, rather, it is the recognition of one's own place in space and time, in society, and in the totality. This recognition does not allow one to sever one's ritualized modes of life, for it is in this lived domain that the meaning of life is discovered. The section on Saptana lays the foundation for the philosophy of food, because we need a good philosophy of food. The section begins with the origins of food, or anna, as that which retains vitality. The creator of sentient beings, the text states, also creates food through his medha, or wisdom, and tapas, or ardor. The complementary dualism of action and knowledge is epitomized here in terms of food, which is a co-creation of wisdom and action. It's in this context that the concept of Atman appears. This Atman, however, is distinct from what Shankara's philosophy grounds. This is not the witnessing consciousness as the Atman. On the contrary, this Atman is composed of speech, of mind, and of vitality. This recognition of the triadic self, which weaves speech and vitality as integral to mentation, is what makes the Atman integral to the body and speech. The Atman, in this account, is not transcendent to the body, and embodied modes of action are not contrary to the recognition of the self. For the self itself is triadic, and the recognition of the self involves recognition of speech, that is the mantras, recognition of vitality, or the life force flowing through every cell in the body, and recognition of consciousness as integral to the other constituents of the self. Each of these has cosmic domains. Speech itself is Vach, the cosmic speech expressed in terms of mantras. Manas mirrors Purusha's Jyotirvida, or luminous nature, which is explained in the next section, and the vitality integrates the wind and the breath, the cosmic flow of energies and the life energy that flows through the body. In the standard Advaita of Shankara, the term Namarupa either is a compound or as two separate words referring to name and form, appears as a descriptive category for anything that is not Brahman or the Absolute. Triyana Brahmana in the Satapatha or the 3 foot section deviates from this standard category and adds karma alongside nama and rupa. This triadic structure here does not refer to something illusory, but rather to the self, such that the self or the Atman has a triadic structure with name, form, and action being its threefold expression. Even among these three, the text stresses karma or action when it explicitly refers to action as the Atman. The philosophical consequence is noteworthy. The modes of determination are not merely identified with name and form, since there is motion, activity, interaction, and vibrancy among entities. Rather than listing the triadic structure as unreal, the text stresses this to be the self, and in particular, action is underscored as the self. This triadic domain is not described as covered by ignorance, avidya channa, like in Shankara's philosophy. On the contrary, it is satyena channa. This is permeated with the truth and is stressed to be deathless, amrita. We can argue from the perspective of scholastic Advaita that this Atman refers to the phenomenal self and belongs under the domain of avidya. However, the vocabulary here is clear that this is neither under the domain of ignorance nor transitory, but rather deathless. The point I'm trying to make is that self-realization is not against being in the world, but rather a process of recognition that makes our being in the world integral to the essential nature of the self. The fundamental problem in scholastic Advaita becomes clear when reading the Ajata Shatru Brahmana, another section from the same book. The text begins with different visualizations, starting from the visualization of Brahman in the sun. It then gradually progresses through the identification of the moon, lightning, space, air, fire, water, mirror, the directions, the echo, the shadow, and finally the self. The standard reading is that, except for the identification of the self with the Brahman, the rest of the identifications are erroneous. This position is possible only when Brahman is recognized in the absolute and transcendent sense, and its immanence or being in the world is rejected. However, if we consider Brahman as encompassing both the immanent and the transcendent, we realize that every single mode of being, even in mirroring or echoes, manifests the very absolute Brahman. The same applies when analyzing the self moving through different states of consciousness. Standard Advaita recognizes only the transcendent or Turiya state as the real state of the self, the others being under the domain of ignorance. However, if we read the description carefully, we find that the self moves through different states, and the reality of the transcendent state is stressed only to point to an unmanifest state or a state that cannot be determined by name and form, or to explain the state that defies conceptualization. This, however, doesn't mean that the realm of conceptualization, including the 3 states of waking, dreaming, and deep sleep, is unreal or not integral to the self. Scholastic Advaita stresses that if the waking or dreaming states were integral to the self, even realized beings would undergo the same conditioned states of consciousness. However, a liberation that considers only in the uninterrupted flow of undifferentiated consciousness, making all modes of conceptualization part of avidya and therefore to be abandoned, renders Upanishadic philosophy inapplicable to everyday life. Furthermore, enlightened beings would lack the means of communication, making them completely dysfunctional. Again and again, the Satapatha is explicit in describing the binary nature of the Brahman. It is both transcendent and immanent. It is both the mode of being expunged of a determination in terms of Namarupa and the realm of Namarupa itself. The realization of Brahman in this paradigm does not demand the negation of being in the world. The manifest world is as integral to the absolute as the formless transcendent mode of being. The text says the Brahman has two forms, the manifest and the unmanifest, the transitory and the permanent, the enduring one, that which is and that which manifests as. Why is this recognition consequential? Because it makes the philosophy of Jivan Mukti or the concept of Videha very different from what has been stressed in the scholastic Advaita of Sankara. According to this reading, Jivan Mukti is about fully being in the world, total immersion and still being liberated. This is where the meaning of jnana or realization becomes very different. For this realization is not attained at the cost of the world, the body, or Namarupa. Rather, it is the realization of the integral nature of being, that the absolute is all-encompassing, and that, similar to the juice in a sugarcane stalk, the transcendent is infused within the manifest. And there is no need to ignore the stalk in order to recognize the juice underneath. Again, the central concept of moksha needs a similar revision. In this paradigm, liberation is not about rejection of the body, the world, the separation from our lived domain of life. Rather, it's about a full comprehension of the absolute permeating the totality of the manifest and the unmanifest, and the recognition of being in the world as a process, a manifest mode of Brahman itself. The essence is that while the Satapatha still teaches Advaita philosophy, even when interpreted along these lines, this interpretation makes the philosophy of the Satapatha worldly, embodied, and engaged. And this is where I would like to stop. For the philosophy adopted by King Janaka could not have been one underscoring renunciation. While the text integrates Yajnavalkya's renunciation, the dialogue between Yajnavalkya and Maitreyi is consequential. Yajnavalkya admits that the Brahman he has taught throughout his life is something he now wants to experience in isolation from societal norms. But the text does not say that Maitreyi cannot attain the same realization, nor does it mandate that she abandon her household in the quest for self-realization. I believe Vidya has much to offer philosophically, and I'm asking the scholarly community to trace the earliest historical references and reframe the philosophy of Vidya in this new light. I believe our dogmatic reading of the Brahmana text, which favors scholastic reading, has failed us in reaching the heart of the text, making it applicable to our times and addressing our real concerns. At the end of the day, our real concern is not some esoteric experience outside of the world, but rather our own being unfolding in manifold forms through the modes of being in the world. Our self-realization cannot come in isolation from our active modes of being, our longings, and our pursuits. On the contrary, our realization has to acknowledge our collective being and the harmony of our individuated existence with the collective. Thank you so much.